Welcome to Crossroads. 1,500 troops are being prepped by the Trump administration for a potential deployment to good old Minnesota to help quell the movements against the ICE deportations. Also, this ties into the other big picture, what's happening with these protests. It's not just some random grassroots resistance you're watching. There are actually organizations and movements behind these things, at least some of them, right? And socialist groups across the country are actually looking at this as their model to replicate in strategies. You know, they're comrades at arms right there in Minnesota. On another topic also, Trump seems set on acquiring Greenland. He wants it for America, and America's allies are not very happy about this. And now Trump is pushing back by placing tariffs on American allies and countries trying to stop the purchase or other means from taking place. I'll be going into these topics and a lot more today, so make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment. Let's get started. All right, first of all, look, troops may be deployed to Minnesota to help quell the growing movement to block ICE deportations. The Pentagon confirmed they are now prepared to carry out orders if President Donald Trump goes through his plan to invoke the Insurrection Act, something which many presidents have done before. He might do it. Fox News said this. President Donald Trump's administration is prepping 1,500 troops for potential deployment to Minnesota, a senior U.S. official confirmed to Fox News. It says the official says the U.S. Army's 11th Airborne Division, meaning this is not just like National Guard or the Marines, because remember the president can use the U.S. Marines basically at will, mainly to protect U.S. federal forces or federal institutions like buildings. That's what Trump did, for example, in Los Angeles. Using the Army is a little different. Or, the National Guard, too, is kind of like the Marines. You can deploy them for those kinds of purposes. The Army is different. It says this Army branch based in Alaska and specializes in cold weather and mountain warfare, like Minnesota, frankly. It said has given prepare to deploy orders, meaning they might actually be deployed. It notes the Washington Post was first to report the Pentagon's readiness, and the chief Pentagon spokesman, this is Sean Parnell, said this to Fox, quote, "The Department of War is always prepared to execute the orders of the Commander-in-Chief if called upon." It notes as well, Trump on Thursday threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy U.S. military forces to Minnesota if state officials do not start cracking down on the anti-ICE agitators. It notes as well, if the corrupt politicians of Minnesota don't obey the law and stop the professional agitators and insurrectionists from attacking the patriots of ICE who are only trying to do their job, I will institute the Insurrection Act. Trump posted on his Truth Social platform. Now, one more point here. It says that Minneapolis and St. Paul are already hosting some 3,000 federal agents deployed after a massive fraud scandal rocked the state last year. Let me explain what's happening here, right? Now, look, it's not clear whether Trump's going to invoke the Insurrection Act. And this is kind of the other important point with that. Trump says he may not need to, meaning the Insurrection Act, declaring an insurrection, may not be necessary. Why would he say that? Okay, so basically Trump does have the ability to deploy National Guard. He has the ability in some cases to deploy the U.S. Marines. The Marines have a special relationship with the President of the United States. The President has a bit more ability to use the U.S. Marines for that. The Insurrection Act would open a lot of other doors. You'd have access, for example, to military courts. You'd have access to, for example, for using the military as actual law enforcement. And using the military for actual law enforcement, you would need to do that if a state was not enforcing laws, not prosecuting crimes, basically was acting in defiance against the federal government. There was an actual insurrection. Or, for example, if a state were to not be able to deal with an uprising, like what you're watching, Trump is framing it with these anti-ICE protests. There are people effectively trying to stop laws from being enforced. There are people trying to block federal agents from doing their jobs. Or the issue has gone so great that it's destabilized the state. In that case, the president would need to step in, Insurrection Act, deploy the military. Now, when Trump says he may not need to do this, I believe this is what he's saying. What is he saying? We kind of saw him do this already. We saw him do this already in Los Angeles. We saw him do this already in other places. Short of announcing or declaring an insurrection, Trump could do this. He could deploy the National Guard. He could, in some instances, deploy the U.S. Marines. Now, many would argue, as has been argued, for example, in Los Angeles, where Trump did this, many would argue, well, you need the authorization from the state governor or the mayor, for example, of the city, to authorize it. You would need actual permission from the state to do it. The caveat to that, and you can ask anybody who's joined the National Guard because they probably know this because it's part of their training. The caveat to that is the mission they're deployed for. If you deploy the National Guard to act as law enforcement, meaning they're actively enforcing laws and prosecuting crimes and doing that kind of thing, if they're acting as law enforcement, then you need either the support of the local government, meaning they authorize it, or accept the authorization, or you need to declare the Insurrection Act. What Trump seems to be suggesting here is that he can deploy these guys or girls without needing that. Without that authorization, the President of the United States has the ability to use the military, effectively National Guard or Marines, to protect federal agents or to protect federal buildings. That means they can't cross certain lines of acting as law enforcement. What he can do is if Trump has 3,000 U.S. federal forces already deployed to Minnesota, it means that the National Guard or Marines can deploy alongside them. So as National Guard troops go out and do their jobs, effectively what they're doing is you might have one ICE agent or two ICE agents and an actual troop, a soldier, with them for protection. And what that would mean is something very similar to Los Angeles, where the troops acting as protection for federal agents or federal buildings can actually arrest demonstrators. If they throw rocks at them, throw Molotov cocktails at them, try to hit them with their cars, you have the military there as a protective force. That's what that would mean. And it seems that Trump is suggesting that that might be all he needs at this point, given where things are at. Now, on the other side of this, though, there's also a lot of growing pushback against Trump trying to do this. The Washington Free Beacon says this, quote, the ICE watch group at the center of the unruly demonstrations gripping Minneapolis urged supporters to, quote, embrace militancy and escalate their demands by, quote, any means necessary. Now, what might be any means necessary? Well, anything goes, apparently. Now, notes that hours later, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz also encouraged residents to resist ICE, accusing the agency of carrying out a campaign of organized brutality. And it's the Minnesota ICE Watch, which describes itself as an autonomous collective documenting and resisting against ICE, police, and all colonial militarized regimes, meaning basically they regard America itself as a colonial power. It says shared an Instagram post on Wednesday teaching agitators how to relay information on police and or fascist activity at demonstrations. In my take, they're probably like your Antifa types. They probably won't call themselves that, but they seem to be, Antifa ideology motivated, which Trump has designated as a terrorist organization. It's not clear how that applies to like groups that have ideological alignment. We'll have to find out. Further, it says this though. On Wednesday evening, Walz told residents to continue resisting ICE. And that's a big deal, by the way, because if a governor is actually telling the people of a state to resist the federal government, technically that is an insurrection. By definition, if you were to actually define this, that would be defined as an insurrection, where basically a regional leader, you could call it like the head of a state, which in the past would be like a country versus an empire. you actually have an individual encouraging people to fight against the government effectively. They're resisting federal agents. It notes that agents are just, quote, plain grabbing Minnesotans and shoving them into unmarked vans, kidnapping innocent people with no warning and no due process, he said. He said, quote, let's be very, very clear. This long ago stopped being a matter of immigration enforcement. Instead, it is a campaign of organized brutality against the people of Minnesota by our own federal government. So, is that an insurrection? Is he declaring an insurrection? At the very least, you could say that he's using the talking points that are used by the new establishment. You can see it in the media, which basically a lot of them are just political actors. The media working in cahoots with political parties, working in cahoots with local officials. They have, kind of marching in lockstep type narratives. What is the narrative? The delegitimization of the federal government is what the narrative is. The narrative they have is that, again, ICE agents carrying out their job are brutes, that their arrests and deportations are kidnappings, they're covering their faces, meant to, again, because they're getting doxxed and their families are being threatened, is meant to hide the nature that they're unknown individuals, hide their identities. Why would their identities need to be known? So they can dox them, they can target them, they can harass them. That's the reason. And so the common narrative you have here is a delegitimization of the federal government and a call to resist federal law enforcement. You could actually call that an insurrection. That would, if you wanted to push it in a conventional sense, that would be, I think, very strongly debatable, at least. That would be grounds to declare an insurrection, but we'll see what happens. But there's also another piece of what's happening in Minnesota, and this is going to be important if Trump does not move more strongly against it. This is being viewed as a model, and socialist groups, including right here in New York City, they actually want to use the Minnesota model all across the United States. We'll be talking more about this after we come back from a quick break.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment. You are, of course, watching Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. I'm just here to share a message about American Hartford Gold, my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, obviously, the recent tariffs have made the markets super turbulent and volatile. With every new piece of tariff news, the markets seem to either crash up or crash down. And of course, it's worth mentioning that these conditions don't only affect Wall Street. They affect all of us through our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I'd like to introduce you to a company that I trust and I myself use to secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move our assets into something tangible, into something you can actually hold, which is physical gold and physical silver, two precious metals that act as a hedge against all those decisions being made in Washington, D.C. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your door, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive offer. When you call them today and you mention the name Joshua, you could receive up to $15,000 in free silver with your initial investment. Take advantage of their special offer. You can either just call them at 877-260-2764 or text Joshua to 65532. All their information will also be down in the description box below. And now, back to Crossroads.
Welcome back. The other big piece of what's happening right now with the anti-ICE protests in Minnesota, if Trump doesn't stop them, if Trump doesn't do something about it, it's going to spread. And already Minnesota is being used as kind of the model for a new grassroots resistance. Now, it's important to note these are not really grassroots, not technically. There are actually organizations and movements behind them. And socialist groups right here in New York City, they're actually looking at how to replicate these strategies being used by their comrades in arms in Minnesota. Let me show you this. New York Post said this: New York City socialists are mustering an army of more than 4,000 anti-ICE activists to form rapid response battalions and obstruct the feds in an expected imminent crackdown on illegal migrants in the Big Apple, right here in New York City. And it's that Mayor Mamdani's comrades with the DSA, the Democrat Socialists of America. It's technically a third party, but they they've merged themselves into the Democratic Party, and they're kind of taking over the Democrats right now, or trying to. There's some pushback against it. And notes the DSA outlined the mission Thursday at a monthly meeting of their Immigrant Justice Working Group in the swanky Midtown digs of the Chinese Communist Party-linked People's Forum, where photos of communist idols Fidel Castro and Che Guevara decorate the walls. And a DSA leader, who only identified herself as Marina, told the crowd of more than 100 members, quote, "As we've seen in other cities, we still do anticipate a big wave of federal immigration enforcement." She said, quote, "It can be confusing, it can be scary, it can be kind of uncertain what's happening in New York right now, but we want to be on our front foot if and when it does." And they're actually taking action on this. It says this: the New York City chapter is training 2,000 DSA members and another 2,000 non-members, along with activating 50 additional trainers. That is a lot of people. Now, briefly on this, remember, this was kind of the big campaign. This was the political campaign we were watching develop. What is the reality in the United States with elections? Every election needs to have a get out the vote movement. The reality with the Democrats more so is that it tends to be like mass protests, outrage campaigns, what you would call agitation propaganda. They need to get people angry, hateful, marching on the street, protesting, rioting. This has been the model for elections since about the second term of Obama. This has been the way they do it. A lot of this is not really the Democrat Party itself. It's through these groups like DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. They're using communist strategies for get out the vote drives. Now, it used to be Black Lives Matter was their big thing. Then it turned into, the Stop Trump pink hat type people. Then it turned into, other attempted movements, smaller scale. The anti-ICE movements are their big one now. The No Kings rally was a big test on this. The riots you saw take place in Los Angeles are a big test on this. Trump largely stopped that for a little bit because when he deployed the National Guard to LA, that was kind of the thing that quelled the fires, maybe literally speaking, but figuratively as well. And you're now watching these groups believe, it seems, that they have enough grassroots support, enough ability to get people out rioting about this, protesting on it, and maybe that it will be politically advantageous to them enough that they can spread this as a model across the United States. And DSA, operating under the People's Forum, which they notice Communist Party of China tied, is actually looking to mobilize now, train, and actually spread this model across the country. Now also remember this, as I mentioned briefly, the anti-ICE protest did not start in Minnesota, right? Some of the bigger movements to block ICE, those were in good old Los Angeles, the second largest Spanish-speaking city in the world. Those are the large-scale protests where people are burning cars and throwing rocks at passing cars and police and federal agents. You might remember I was out on the streets reporting when that was happening. I showed you, in fact, several cars were lit on fire during that time. It was a bit wild. But now guess what's happening in LA? A judge is now stopping Los Angeles police, LAPD, from using less lethal foam bullets against protesters. Now, Breitbart said this: U.S. District Court Judge Consuelo B. Marshall issued an order Thursday forcing LAPD officers to stop using 40-millimeter foam projectiles against protesters. Now, to be fair, 40-millimeter ain't no small bullet. Yes, they're foam. They can hurt you. 40-millimeter, if I'm not mistaken, is the kind of things you put in those little grenade launchers, and they can hurt you quite a bit. You might call them like beanbag guns, that kind of thing. They can pretty badly mess you. They probably won't kill you, but they can mess you up. And as ABC7 noted, the order is tied to a case filed by Black Lives Matter in 2020 and is the result of Marshall finding the LAPD in contempt of his 2021 ruling in that case. And it said Marshall, this judge, indicated that LAPD officers fired at protesters who did not pose an immediate threat, failed to issue warnings before firing, and struck protesters in restricted areas of the body. What areas might those be? It notes, the order included a list of examples of misuse of the weapons, including one officer who fired at a man who had his hands up at a protest, then shot the same man in the face, causing a jaw injury that required surgery. Another officer shot a woman in the head with the weapon while she was seated and holding a sign. A third officer shot a man in the groin. There were videos of that, I believe. Then shot a lawyer in the groin when the lawyer asked the officer for his name. I'm sorry. Anyways, we saw this happen. Briefly on this as well, you have a lot of these activists out there. Antifa, for example, they bring media. A lot of them believe that being a journalist, quote unquote, is nothing more than carrying around a camera and basically doxing people. Typically, they're not doing anything more than, they're not really journalists in terms of being news reporters. They're people out there working as kind of the agents of these, protesters. You have legal groups that do the same thing. There are actually lawyers who go alongside, for example, Antifa and other things, and they work side by side with rioters and protesters. And so that's kind of where this comes from, right? Why is that happening? It's because these are not grassroots. These are organized, trained, deployed movements, and they're doing this for a very clear political purpose. These are not like grassroots random things. These are organized protests, trained protesters working in conjunction with different organizations, including lawyers groups that get a lot of funding from organizations trying to use this for political purpose. And then the unfortunate reality too, and I don't know about this, Judge, but the unfortunate reality too is this: a lot of the money behind these groups, some of the same individuals funding them also fund the campaigns of judges and district's attorney and other things who actively are put in their place because they're talking about defunding the police or race-based law enforcement and those kinds of things. These people, these media, these lawyers, these, again, judges or district attorney, are often funded by some of the same individuals pushing the same agendas. And unfortunately, they do tend to work in cahoots with each other. Now, I don't know about this judge, I don't know about this case in particular, but that is a case pretty common across the United States right now. And of course, the reality is a lot of this has deeply political connotations. Now, in terms of these 40 millimeter foam bullets, getting hit with a 40 millimeter foam bullet is not like a Nerf gun. A 40 millimeter foam bullet is going to badly ruin your day, no matter where you get hit. And the other reality with this, we've seen abuses in use of force with these things previously. I've reported on it. January 6 protesters, the police used a lot of illegal things against them, including firing down from elevated positions, which you can strike. They were firing actual rubber bullets. Strike someone in the head, you can kill them. Hit them in the eye, you can blind them. They were doing it just firing into crowds, which is a major violation of use of force. We never really saw the law get enforced on that, but that is a huge violation in the use of force. There are issues like that. Throwing, for example, certain types of concussion grenades into crowded areas where you can kill people, doing that kind of thing. Very large-scale abuses in use of force. The other side of this is that, less than lethal weapons are what prevent police from having to use actual lethal force. And you have seen actually that, especially with the Black Lives Matter protests and riots, oftentimes the police were not given proper reinforcements. The police were not given actual riot control powers. The police were held back, and police were actually put in serious harm's way. You had officers getting assaulted on mass scale. When you had a lot of, again, representatives complaining about January 6th and saying that officers were killed. No, not a single officer was killed. They're lying to you about that. I don't know why this continues to be lied about, but they're lying to you about it. Not a single officer was killed that day. Officer Sicknick died afterwards. It had nothing to do with that. They're lying to you. But a lot of officers were in fact harmed. The numbers of assaults on officers at the BLM riots were far, far, far greater. And as opposed to the January 6th narrative, you actually had a lot of again, federal officials and representatives very much defending this type of violence. Officers were put in harm's way. Officers had their hands tied behind their backs. Officers were punished for using normal forms of law enforcement. And the reality is, even under what would normally be considered lawful arrests, under normal circumstances, if a riot is declared, if you're even on the streets, you're going to get a felony. I know people who've actually had that happen to them. It's very serious, actually. But with the BLM riots, that was not really enforced. And so officers were put in this kind of situation. The problem you're going to have is if you make it so if officers cannot use necessary forms of less than lethal defenses, you make it so that they are more likely to have to use more deadly forms of defensive systems. And you may actually cause more violence. You may actually make things worse. I know a lot of the way that some of the conservative outlets are framing this is effectively that it seems that maybe some of these activists are trying to create violence because if someone tries to run an ICE agent over with their vehicle and gets shot for using what is assault with a deadly weapon, a vehicle is assault with a deadly weapon, it has political uses. All right? There are people who use it politically. Some of them very much want that. Some of them actually want a handful of people getting killed because for them it is politically advantageous. I'm not saying they all want that, but that is kind of the other side of the argument with this, that if you make it so that police cannot use less than lethal forms to protect themselves, you may actually cause violence, and that will be weaponized politically for these protesters and rioters and movements, groups like DSA that have actively done things like this in the past, using these types of movements. Now look, on another topic though, speaking of the new America, Trump seems pretty set on getting Greenland for the United States. He wants it. He says nothing short of us getting it is going to suffice. And a lot of U.S. allies, including many NATO members, are not very happy about this. In fact, they're very big unhappy. And they're trying to stop it from happening. But now guess what? Trump is rolling out a brand new stage in his bid for saying, well, guess what? We're taking it. Let's see it try to stop us. And Trump's doing something interesting. He's placing tariffs on the countries trying to prevent the purchase from taking place. Now, Trump said on Truth Social, quote, "We have subsidized Denmark and all of the countries of the European Union and others for many years by not charging them tariffs or any other forms of remuneration. And on that point too, America has done that, not even just Trump. The United States used to effectively allow Europe to tariff us, and we would not reciprocate that. Germany, for example, was allowed to place 100% tariffs on American vehicles. We did not do it in retaliation. Italy, massive tariffs. France, massive tariffs. All these countries, massive tariffs. And a lot of very restrictive trade policies where American companies were prevented from doing businesses in their countries. Americans were subsidizing the low cost, and still are, by the way, the low cost of medications in these countries. That's why Trump actually made it so that pharmaceutical companies have to give Americans most favored trading status among first world countries only, meaning we're still subsidizing low cost medications for like the entire third world of the world. But Americans were basically paying for cheap medications for Europe. The United States was paying for the defense of Europe, including NATO, including a lot of the UN budget, including, for example, providing most of the defensive structure, U.S. military bases and otherwise deployments in these countries. We pay for their defense, and we have been for a long time. And so Trump is basically arguing, look, we've let you guys do this to us. We've basically made it so you don't have to pay for your defense. We've basically made it so you can redirect your money to your social welfare programs. We've let you fine American tech companies. We've let you mess with our prices on pharmaceuticals. We've let your companies even mess with food prices in America and do price setting, which is technically illegal, and never enforced it. And he's saying, well, look, we want something in return. And Trump says this, He says, now after centuries, which is interesting, he's talking about, what is this, centuries, right? He's talking about the 1800s. Well, he's talking about, of course, Denmark, right? He said, it is time for Denmark, which controls Iceland currently, to give it back. To give back. World peace is at stake, he says. He says China and Russia want Greenland. They're not hiding it, by the way. And he says there's not a thing that Denmark can do about it. Basically, he's saying China and Russia are making incursions into the Arctic. China and Russia are already trying to take Greenland. And Greenland is not powerful enough to stop them from doing it. He's also noting Denmark is not powerful enough to do anything about it, nor are they trying to. He's saying effectively, you want to talk about the sovereignty of Greenland? It's already gone, and America is the only place that can stop that from happening. And Trump says they currently have 2 dog sleds as protection, one added recently. He's not joking, by the way. He says, only the United States of America under President Donald J. Trump can play in this game, and very successfully at that. He says nobody will touch this sacred piece of land, especially since the national security of the United States and the world at large is at stake. Basically, he's suggesting that America is what is defending most of Europe. America is what is defending the free world. America is what is basically protecting even the Asia-Pacific region nations against China. He's saying that none of these countries pull their own weight in the free world in terms of being able to defend themselves. And if America is taken off the table, the free world comes to an end. That's what he's saying, basically. He says on top of everything else, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland have journeyed to Greenland for purposes unknown. By the way, some of them are even deploying limited military forces to Greenland, not to protect them against China and Russia, but with the kind of message being sent to protect them against the United States. Notably, some of the German troops deployed and immediately undeployed. People are questioning whether that's because it's extremely cold in Greenland. If you don't have a good warm place to sleep, you're going to die. It's very cold there. We don't know the reason then. But Trump says this is a very dangerous situation for the safety, security, and survival of our planet. Meaning if Greenland is taken over by the CCP, and he says these countries who are playing this very dangerous game have put a level of risk in play that is not tenable or sustainable. Therefore, it is imperative that, in order to protect the global peace and security, strong measures be taken so that this potentially perilous situation end quickly and without question. Now, what is Trump saying? Basically, most of Western Europe is being threatened with China, Russia. They don't have the ability to properly defend themselves. Russia dominates them on energy because they decided, you know what? We want to be sustainable. They went to, wind turbines and solar panels, and now they get brownouts and blackouts all the time. So they have to buy dirty energy from Russia. Makes sense, right? Well, they've done that. And because of that, Russia now basically controls these countries. At least they're trying to break out of them. They're making some grounds on it. But they're also finding the reality that they have to defend themselves and defend their region because Trump pulled America out of that region, and now they have to deal with Ukraine and help protect them against Russia and deal with Russian threats. Rather than do that, they're moving their forces to Greenland to challenge the United States. And the question Trump is raising is, look, why don't you deal with Russia? Why don't you deal with that? Why are you threatening America militarily? Now, they would say because you're trying to do the same thing Russia's doing, which is conquer a NATO ally. Technically, Ukraine is not really a NATO ally. They kind of are. They used to not be. It's a weird green area or middle area. But he says this, quote, starting on February 1st, 2026, all of the above mentioned countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, will be charged a 10% tariff on any and all goods sent to the United States of America. Briefly on this, Trump already has some limited tariffs on all these countries. An additional 10% tariff would be economically devastating to them, frankly. This would hit them very, 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 very hard. This would be pretty bad. It would not be like, okay, it wouldn't be devastating. It would hit them very hard. But Trump says this, on June 1st, 2026, the tariff will be increased to 25%. That would wreck them, in addition to the other tariffs. Trump says this tariff will be due and payable until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. In other words, it's not clear whether Trump is saying, look, you get your money back if you let us make a deal, we'll have to see. Trump is saying, you are going to have your economies destroyed, and you're going to have to basically deal with your own regional defense and start paying your fair share on medications, and we're not going to let you gerrymander the prices of food anymore, which means basically, even without this, these countries can no longer probably fund. The reality for a lot of these countries, they're no longer going to be able to fund their social welfare programs. America basically has been subsidizing it. They're going to have to put a lot more money in defense. Medication is going to be a lot more expensive. The whole Nordic model of free healthcare is probably going to disappear with that alone. If Trump hits them with an additional 25% tariff, this will basically destroy these countries as they currently exist. And Trump is saying the only exception to that, destroy them as we know them. They would have to like massively reform the way they spend money, which in their case, because a lot of these are socialist countries, even the conservative parties in these countries are deeply socialist by American standards, they would be forced to make massive political changes. It would change the nature of these countries. The only way they have out is, as Trump says, complete and total purchase of Greenland by the United States. Let America make a deal. Not only let us make a deal, but until a deal is made, the tariffs are in place. Trump says the United States has been trying to do this transaction for over 150 years. He says many presidents have tried, and for good reason, but Denmark has always refused. It's not up to Greenland. Denmark is the one doing it. He says now, because of the Golden Dome, which is Trump's basic model of a missile defense system similar to the Israeli Iron Dome, and Trump says in modern day weapon systems, both offensive and defensive, we need to acquire this is especially important. He says hundreds of billions of dollars are currently being spent on security programs. He says having to deal with the dome, and he says including for the possible protection of Canada, and this very brilliant, it's Trump's idea. Trump says, this very brilliant but highly complex system can only work at its maximum potential and efficiency because of angles, medes, and bounds if this land is included in it, meaning America needs Greenland to do it. Briefly on that, if you look at Russian missile trajectories that would head to, for example, Washington, D.C. or the eastern seaboard of the United States, and remember, any major war targeting America would basically target the seaboards because that's how we deploy our military abroad. It would need to hit like San Diego and Washington, D.C. and a few key areas because these would be the command centers. Were Russia to launch nuclear missiles at us, it would not go all across Europe. It would not go all across the Pacific. It would go through the Arctic. And if you look at the trajectories going from most of Russia targeting the eastern seaboard of America, most of that would have to go over Greenland. That's what he's referring to. It would actually, it would go not even just the northern part of Greenland, it would pass over basically all of Greenland. And you could say that some of it also goes over Canada, not all of it does. And so Trump is suggesting that Greenland, and it actually is true in this sense, Greenland would be necessary for America to have a proper missile defense, dome effect, you could call it. He notes the United States of America is immediately open to negotiation with Denmark and/or any of these countries that have put so much at risk, despite all that we have done for them, including maximum protection over so many decades. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Now, my take on this, What Trump is threatening against these countries is a 25% tariff. He's also suggesting that America is kind of basically, well, we have been, basically protecting these countries. We are effectively their military. Most of Europe does not have a proper military. Some of them have built it back. It's not even all of them. You could argue that Germany and the UK are kind of the defensive backbone of most of Western Europe. Some other countries have a bit, not enough to wage a full-scale war. France is kind of, in the middle ground with that. And Trump is suggesting that 25% tariff, but basically there's a lot more we could do to them if we wanted to. For example, not allowing them to gerrymander the price of medications anymore. Trump's already kind of moving on that. But their reliance on American pharmaceutical companies could change that quite a bit. Trump could actually do a lot on the tech front, not allowing them to gerrymander things with fining American tech companies or big tech. He's already trying to do that. Trump could actually hit them with much greater tariffs, potentially. And the reality for a lot of these countries is we don't really need them with trade. They need us, but we don't really need them. Many people would say, well, they can go to China. Not really, because why? China needs buyers, not sellers. Western Europe needs buyers, not sellers. Canada needs buyers, not sellers. If a buyer goes away, will businesses be able to maintain business by doing business with each other? No, they cannot. Why? They need buyers, not sellers. If you have a bunch of used car salesmen who have nobody who wants to buy a used car, the used car salesmen are not going to work together and stay in business by trying to make business deals between used car lots. Doesn't work that way. They need buyers, not sellers. And if America, being the biggest buyer in the world, says, well, we're going to buy from somewhere else, and we have a lot of options because it's easy to find a seller, it's not easy to find a buyer. In other words, if you're a salesperson, it's harder to find somebody to buy your goods than it is being a customer trying to find a salesperson willing to sell to you. That's the situation with this. Trump is suggesting that effectively America has greater ability to harm these countries if they do not at least stop preventing him from making this deal. But the condition he's put in place to effectively not destroy them economically right now, which is, you could argue whether that's a good or bad move. He's arguing that, or basically putting the condition in place, that unless they not only stop blocking us, but effectively maybe even help us reach a deal to acquire Greenland, because he's saying this is not going to change until that actually happens, their economy is basically on a death clock. That's what Trump is doing to Western Europe right now. That said, what do you all think? Good idea? Bad idea? Anything else you want to talk about? Leave it in the chat. Let's jump into some questions. Let's see here. First of all, happy Monday, by the way, everyone. Foggy01, you're saying, in the freest nation in the world, why do we need to have sanctuary states/cities? Unless they want to have sanctuary from U.S. laws, local, state, and federal, isn't that a division or insurrection from the United States? Technically it is. Why is that? There's a gray area in America, right? Now you could say a lot of this ended with the Civil War. You could actually say that during the Civil War, a lot of the Confederate states, before declaring a confederacy, which was an absolute form of insurrection because they effectively said we're going to create a new government and we're going to break away from the United States and form, a confederacy of states. We can have our own laws and so on. A total rejection of federalization of the federal government, right? That was what was happening. That they were no longer going to recognize federal authority, and every state was going to become a government with an intergovernmental agreement, which was a confederation. That was what they were going to do. Now, you could say during the Civil War, what was the basis of it? Everyone says slavery. That was the main issue, but the narrative, the legal argument, was state rights, right? State rights. Do states have the ability to have their own laws, To what extent can states have their own laws? What if the federal government says, no, you cannot have that law, like slavery? Slavery was regarded as property, and they were saying the federal government does not have the legal authority to seize property. What did the federal government say under Abraham Lincoln? Yes, we can. Yes, we do. And Abraham Lincoln rolled in there and, of course, started the Civil War, right? And after the Civil War, made it so that sanctuary states against, they were trying to maintain slavery. Sanctuary states were no longer a thing, because that's what the Confederate States were trying to do. They were becoming effective sanctuary states against the freeing of slaves. They were saying, we get to keep our slaves, and there's nothing you can do about it, and we have sanctuary from federal law. That changed after the end of the Civil War. And what effectively happened was, because of the amendments to the Constitution, they made it so that there were certain protections given to American citizens, certain recognition of children of slaves, recognition fully of children of slaves as being American citizens, and effectively the full end of slavery and the enforcement of the Constitution, not only at the federal level, but also at the level of state government. But it also did away with a lot of state sovereignty. States no longer had the full ability to maintain their laws, especially if they went awry with federal law. States have to enforce federal law. States have to have that. That's why you have federal crimes and you have, misdemeanor crimes, right? A federal crime, a felony, is a big deal. A misdemeanor crime, not as much. State law versus federal law. And so, when the federal government is now moving to enforce the law, and you have states saying, we will not let you enforce the law, yes, you could argue it. I think it's a delicate line, because we don't want to have a second civil war. We don't want that. But to a degree, the states are acting in defiance of law enforcement and of federal authority. And so you could actually argue that it's similar. Now, the other side, I would say, though, is you saw the same argument coming from Republicans when Biden was president. For example, it was kind of on the opposite side. You might remember Texas had put buoys in the Rio Grande to prevent mass migration. The Biden administration, which was actively facilitating illegal immigration into the United States under the United Nations Agreement, which was the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and through federal funding to the United Nations to facilitate that, and through the funding of it through various NGOs, non-governmental organizations, including using the National Guard to help facilitate, and the Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol to run the processing camps to, again, bring in intentionally migrants from every corner of the earth to repopulate the United States, and to do, let's say bolstering the residency of different areas, which would then be counted in the census. No conspiracy there, I'm sure. But you might remember when when Texas was trying to stop that, they put buoys in the water. The Biden administration argued that that was a violation of the law, because it is the federal government's authority to basically manage the security of the borders. Texas was saying the federal government is delinquent in the enforcement of border laws. If you go back to the original doctrine of federalization, the federal government had very little authority. I'm talking like early America, time of the Founding Fathers. Basically protect the borders of the United States, protect us against foreign threats and domestic threats, and also manage international trade and diplomacy. Basically diplomacy, tariffs, border protection, and wars. That was the federal government, and that was about it. And the federal government being delinquent on one of those key authorities, i.e. the securing of the borders of the nation, Texas argued that they, as a state, had the legal right to fill the gap of where the federal government was delinquent in its role. And you could argue that many Republicans are very supportive of that at the time. The Biden administration made the argument that no, you're not a sanctuary state. No, you cannot enforce laws in lieu of federal authority. And that kind of went back and forth, and that was also a big legal challenge. You also saw the same thing in Florida, where they were trying to enforce border laws. The federal government tried stopping them from enforcing border laws. And also when it came to some things like trans issues and other things, the federal government was arguing this is an issue of civil rights. It's Martin Luther King Day, by the way, so happy Martin Luther King Day to y'all. A lot of it had to do with civil rights, and they were arguing effectively that gender is part of civil rights protection. That was an interpretation under Barack Obama. Obama started the whole thing around the, trans rights and so on, and the reinterpretation of civil rights protections as applying to gender identity, not even just, medical gender, but gender identity. That was Obama. States were saying we need to act in defiance of this, and you could say that there were some Republican states that were saying that. And so, there is an ongoing question of to what degree can states challenge federal law enforcement. And that's also the basis of the sanctuary states. Now, you would say that the way you handle it is through the courts. You have to bring legal challenges, and as we've seen, things bounce around like a pong table with, local judge makes a decision, they put all the enforcement on hold, it gets appealed, it goes to the next stage, they open it back up, and it goes back and forth like this. And the lights turn on and off in terms of, whether there's actual law enforcement or not. We've seen that happen. The other key thing to note, though, is the authority of sheriffs. And so sheriffs, American sheriffs, are the most traditional form of law enforcement in the United States. This is different from city police, which technically have to answer to the mayor. Under the Constitution, sheriffs were the original, intentional, legal form of law enforcement. I know these other forms are legal as well, but again, I'm talking about the original America. The sheriff was an elected official, meaning you vote for him. The sheriff goes in place, the sheriff appoints deputies, and if a sheriff believes that a federal law or a state law is not constitutional, the sheriff can block it from being enforced. He just tells his deputies, we're not going to enforce this one, boys. And you have that also. There are a lot of sheriffs across the United States in states that have very strict gun laws who have actually given orders and made public statements that their deputies will not enforce gun grabs or things that violate the Second Amendment, or they will not follow what they call unconstitutional orders. America has very broad laws in place to prevent unconstitutional orders from being carried out by military or police. That is the reality of the United States. Mayors are able to bypass some of that through the use of, state police or local police, right? The police departments. It's a bit complicated. But there were also issues during the Trump administration, during the Biden administration, where you had sheriffs becoming constitutional sheriffs. You might remember on Crossroads, I even interviewed some of them. There is a legal basis to this. And there were some of them saying that they even had the authority, it would be debatable, but technically, to even arrest federal agents if federal agents deployed to a state to carry out what they regarded, based on the determination of the sheriff, to carry out unconstitutional laws, to enforce unconstitutional laws. The sheriff would be able to arrest even a federal agent. According to that group, although we've not really seen this, be put on trial. It would be a very controversial trial, but there's a lot of arguments for that. Short answer to this long answer is there is some debatable legal ground for sanctuary states and cities, but it's a very much gray area for this country still. Even since the Civil War. And even at that time, it was a big argument, right? State rights versus federal law. We never fully determined where the line is. We still, to this day, have not fully determined where the line is between federal and state. Emotion 007, you're saying it's sad the fact that we subsidize these countries, you're talking about Greenland and Germany and France and so on, and the UK challenging us. We subsidize these countries and they turned around trying to stab us in the back. We don't need them. They can't survive without us. Yeah, it is true, actually. So let's put it this way. The authority of the European Union technically does not extend beyond the borders of the European Union. The additional authority they've gained through being able to influence America or influence other countries comes in two forms. Mainly because America has allowed it. We let them fine our companies and do all these other things. And because of their roles within the United Nations. NATO has made these countries powerful because America subsidizes it. These countries have become economically powerful because we've effectively subsidized it, frankly, through funding their defense so they can redirect money from taxes to things like social welfare and so on. A lot of their authority also comes from the United Nations, which we fund. America basically foots the bill for NATO. We foot the bill for the UN. We foot most of it. We foot the bill for the cost of medications in Europe. We foot the bill for their ability to, again, maintain a lot of their business practices. We buy from them. Without us, their economy goes right down the drain. And that is the reality for a lot of these, not even just Europe, but for a lot of countries. And also, we're very good allies, but they don't treat us like that. A lot of Europe has deep disdain for the United States. They hate America. They hate Americans. They dislike us to a very, very broad extent. They look down on us. And the reality is there's I wouldn't even call it no gratitude. They've gone far beyond that to believe they don't have a need for gratitude. Because they don't believe that they don't believe they owe us that, of course. And, a lot of that is because frankly, America's never done anything about it. The reality is post-World War II, basically most of the world was economically devastated. The only real country that was in a good situation economically after World War II was the United States. And that helped the United States basically, well, it did help us, not even basically, but it did help us become the global power. Because America was a very strong economic power post-World War II, Germany, Japan, of course, and its allies like Italy and others were the losers of that war. Mexico was an ally, Brazil was an ally of the Nazis, not well known, by the way. Many of these countries were economically destroyed. And, then went under the control of the winners. Germany was broken into East Germany and West Germany. We saw how that went with the Soviet Union controlling East Germany. Japan went to the United States, and America built these countries back. And we did it by actually allowing them to make business deals with us that, were very unfair to Americans, letting them charge 100% tariffs on our goods while we didn't charge them anything. America made very bad for us business deals with Europe to allow them to recover from the economic damage they had undergone during World War II. Then the Cold War hit, and you had revolutions all over the place. East Germany turned into a hellhole because of the Soviets. America mostly, but also some United Nations allies, fought against the Chinese and the North Koreans in Korea. America built South Korea. The modern South Korean economy and state of it is very different from North Korea because of the United States. Same with Taiwan and foreign engagement with Taiwan and American protection of Taiwan until Carter came around, and we still maintained it quite a bit. The economic benefits really experienced by the first world countries is largely to do with American support, and even the prevention of famines and genocides in much of the third world was because of the United States, and especially because of our policies against communist revolutions, which at the time in place, you could argue morally against the United States killing guerrillas and so on like that. You can make the counter argument that the alternative would have been what we witnessed when it was not stopped. What does it look like when it's not stopped? It looks like Cambodia. It looks like the boat people of Vietnam. When it's not stopped, you had guerrillas and communist groups massacring, a third of the population. That's what it looked like when it was not stopped. When it was stopped, it looked like America or American allies maybe throwing some communists out of helicopters or something like that. You could argue the morality of it, but the reality is America prevented probably what would have been much broader use of genocide by communist regimes and guerrilla forces, which were actively doing it and still are, by the way. Look at Sudan and South Africa right now. And so the reality is a lot of these countries disdain us. They hate us. Why is that? It's because it's not everybody in these countries who hates America. It's a lot of the socialists who hate us because America has kind of been stopping socialism, frankly. Although you could argue we're also falling to it too now to an extent. Some of the conservatives in these countries don't like us because they kind of still see us as like a more liberal form to their more conventional Catholicism and traditional cultures. They do see us as kind of like the kids on the block a little bit. But I think the conservatives don't hate us because they see what we represent. But that is the state of Europe, basically. The reality with Europe is they're basically living an illusion right now. They're living in an American subsidized, positive to an extent, economic state. They're able to be a lot of them are syndicalist countries. If you want to talk about forms of socialism, most of Europe Western Europe, they practice a blend of syndicalism, right, which is a communism enforced by unions, especially France, and as ironic as it sounds, a form of national socialism. They're technically practicing state interventionism with economic policies almost identical to the Nazi Party. I'm not saying they have the identity politics, but they use economic policies which are basically one in one with the Nazis, right? Deep use of federal control to dominate the businesses. You would call it state capitalism, would be another way you could call it, right? They basically use Nazi economics and syndicalism, communism enforced through unions and powerful union forces as their form of socialism. And the unions demand a lot of the social welfare programs. The social welfare programs are made only possible by the bad trade deals and lack of defense budgets, which are basically subsidized by American taxpayers. That is the hard reality for Europe. That is the very hard reality for Europe, frankly. A lot of them do not like hearing this. Their dream, the bubble could burst in an instant, frankly. And these countries would be forced into political reform were that bubble to be burst, because the state of living they enjoy is not something that would be sustainable without the support of the United States. It would not be maintainable, frankly. And so Trump is effectively threatening not only economic pain, he's threatening basically political implosion for these countries. And the reality of Europe too is because a lot of them are syndicalist. They are syndicalists. The unions are very powerful. If the unions did not get the social programs that they want, the social welfare and crazy days off and subsidized medicine and everything else, what do you think the unions in France would do? They would riot. There'd be chaos. They exert so much control over these countries that they can cripple the entire countries, and they do pretty often, by the way, but on a much larger scale, because the governments would risk becoming effectively economically insolvent with a combination of losing American subsidization of medical care, military support, and also not only the elimination of American, unbalanced trade deals with them, the ability to fine American tech companies through international enforcement of their laws against ours, and also on top of it, the use of tariffs, which would create also probably more economic pain for them. their economies would implode, as would the current system of government as they know it. And so, yeah, it's not a good thing for them, frankly. Maybe that would be better for them. I don't know. I think being forced to have reform to unsustainable policies might not be the worst thing for them, but I think doing it overnight or doing it rapidly would be detrimental to them. It would not be a very nice thing to do to a country, put it that way. Michael Baker, you're saying, it's amazing how folks would become angry if someone stole their car, won't react at all when their rights are stolen. Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like the boiling the frog analogy, right? Let's put it this way. All right, let's put it this way. If you had $100,000 in the bank and your next door neighbor asks to borrow your credit card and bought himself like a $50,000 car with your credit card and said, "Thanks, neighbor," would you feel angry at him? I'd feel kind of angry if my neighbor stole $50,000 from me and bought something stupid with it. Let alone, even without buying something stupid, I'd be very unhappy if they stole $50,000 from me, frankly. Now, take that in another way. If you have $100,000 in the bank and the Federal Reserve doubles the money in circulation by printing double currency, effectively reducing the tangible value of your money by half, meaning they stole $50,000 from you effectively, do you still feel angry? You tell me. I think it has to do with it has to do with tangible versus intangible theft, or immediate versus not immediate theft. There are forms of theft that are more nuanced, forms of theft that are more visible. I think it's similar to like the way that people are kind of numb to numbers when they hear about genocides versus when they hear about a single crime take place. For example, you can hear about migrant crime. You can hear about, let's say, 70,000 Americans killed a year by fentanyl. Trump says up to 100,000 a year. But the reality is we don't fully know. It depends on how you count a fentanyl death, right? But you're talking like more Americans killed every year by fentanyl than, the Vietnam War. That's a lot of people every year. When you talk a number like that, you can be like, yeah, that's pretty crazy. But it doesn't elicit the same form of outrage as a single case. For example, a lot of this has to do with migrants and gangs and the crime they bring into the United States. And when people put a face on a victim, the interpretation of it becomes very different. Laken Riley, for example. I would actually argue people become more angry about the murder and rape of Laken Riley by a migrant or an illegal alien than they do about hearing about 70,000 Americans killed every year by fentanyl. Why is that? It's more real. There's a face to it. It's a person. It's visible. You can see it. There's a story to it. It's the same way with any kind of outrage. This is actually also on a political scale why Democrats tend to be a lot more effective than Republicans. Why is that? Okay, so let me tell you this. As a journalist, as a TV host, I'm a storyteller, right? If you want to get into I'm very much into the history of journalism. I helped actually form a lot of the standards of news that we have at the Epoch Times. A lot of us did, but I was part of a lot of those discussions. We have a very interesting approach to it, which is we try to use what we call traditional journalism. What is traditional journalism? It means the sole role you have is to present the truth to people, seek the truth and report it, and to give people an accurate understanding of the world. If I were to boil down our approach to news in the simplest terms, that is what we've come up with. That is our interpretation, and that is our model of journalism, if you're watching Epoch Times or reading Epoch Times. Seek the truth, report it, and give people an accurate understanding. It's as simple as that. I think if all media were to do that, the world would be a much better place. That also requires a type of fearlessness, and there's a lot of deeper nuance to it. The other side to it, though, is you also need, the history of journalism is not just print and media. It also goes into older forms of news telling. The oldest forms of journalism were actually the storytellers. It was the city crier. It was the official emissary. It was in the Roman Empire when you would have the imperial, official go and they'd put copper tablets in the town square and they'd write the imperial edicts or the news. That was, you could argue, one of the original forms of news telling. The other original newspaper would be in China. It was later called the Peking Gazette. It was a page of official government edicts or edicts. That is the original newspaper in the world. If you read a book called I think it's called The Free Press, there was an argument of how the printing press changed news telling. Prior to the ability to have printed news, and before, when the most you could do was have literal bronze tablets, or emissaries from the emperor coming and giving a scroll and reading it in the town square. The mass media, made possible by the printing press, changed the nature of how information was relayed. In much of the world, information was relayed by storytellers, by minstrels, as funny as that sounds, by skalds, by criers, by fast runners, by people who carried the news from one place to the next. And the integrity or the believability of the news had to do with the honesty of the individual. And so a lot of people were not happy with the creation of print media because they felt it removed the human element in news telling. You no longer knew the integrity of the person telling you the story. My point in saying this is that news always had an element of making something interesting, of being able to speak in a compelling way. It would be, the nature of Cicero, for example, and the types of debates in the town square you'd find in ancient Rome. It had to do with the ability of the orators to go out and talk in the town square and tell people there are barbarians at the gate and here's why you need to get off your butts and go defend yourself, right? That tradition is part of news telling. That is, in the original sense, what a journalist should be. And so a good journalist is an honest person. A good journalist is someone willing to be in danger for the sake of being willing to say what others are not willing to say. And a journalist is an orator and a storyteller. Why do I say this? It also ties into politics. So there are two ways you present a story. You maximize or you minimize. And you need to kind of do a mix of, in my interpretation, you need to do a mix of both in order to make something understandable. What do I mean by this? So if I were to pick a story, there are many ways you can tell it, right? There are a lot of ways you can tell a story. If I were to do a story about mass migration, for example, I'd tell you the facts, I'd tell you the big picture, and I might tell you an on-the-ground viewpoint or personal story of somebody to represent what it looks like when it's being carried out. Republicans in America are more focused on maximizing. They're more focused on big picture, 70,000 people killed by fentanyl, this type of stuff. Democrats are very good at minimizing. They're good at storytelling. When a Democrat politician goes up, what do? I grew up in this neighborhood, and I remember back in the 1970s, we had this guy and that guy, and I knew a woman came up to me and she said this law affected her in such and such a way. They talk like that, right? Rather than talk about evil ICE deporting, 1,000 people today, they say one story, a woman was beaten by ICE. They don't tell you that she tried beating a guy with a shovel, beating a police officer with a shovel, which happened recently, by the way. They don't tell you that. But they'll be like, ICE arrested this woman. And they kind of lie through omission a lot of times because they're trying to make, they're doing it for political purpose usually. So they don't tell you the whole story. But, they do that, right? They minimize it. They want to tell you a personal story. Anyways, back to the point of this, back to Michael Baker's point. You said it's amazing how folks who would become angry if someone stole their car won't react at all when their rights are stolen. It's the difference between big picture or small picture. Small picture actually gets people emotionally engaged. Tangible, real experience. Having your car stolen is a lot different from having your rights stolen, because your rights being stolen are not really tangible or noticeable until it has reached an extreme degree. And that's why actually a lot of people don't realize their rights are stolen until they're already gone. That's the hard reality of it. A question from his daughter. You're saying Trump is not the first president to seek Greenland. Yeah, Trump says for 150 years I've been trying to get it right. Which is true, by the way. You're saying we have lost touch with reality in education and news. We should, in the least, be able to secure a military base on Greenland. We do have a military base in Greenland, but it's not like super solid. You know what I mean? The problem you have with Greenland is they're suffering incursions from China and Russia. China builds infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. They gain control of the infrastructure because of the debt traps. They go into countries and territories like Greenland, and they do this, and they're allowed to. When countries are not able to defend their sovereignty, are they really a country? Well, to the extent that they're able to defend themselves. Otherwise, they're not a country. They're a puppet state. They're a vassal state. They've been conquered through other means, through business, through political manipulation, or through crime. If you talk about Machiavellianism, a very evil ideology, it might take. Machiavellianism, ways of creating puppet states, using mafia tactics or other things like that. A lot of the world is puppeteered like that. I'd say that the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative is a Machiavellian strategy of creating vassal states. And so is drugs. So are drugs and cartels and gangs, by the way. These are tools of creating vassal states by politicizing corruption and then controlling the corruption politically. You understand? If you can control a government through corruption, whoever controls the corruption controls the government. Who controls the government? Who controls the corruption in Latin America? The cartels. Who runs the cartels? Who owns Bartertown? Well, Chinese Communist Party or Master Blaster, right? That's the reality of it. Right? That's the reality of it. They're the syndicate that effectively holds the resources, like good old Master Blaster, right? Master Blaster controls Bartertown. The cartels control the countries because it's a Machiavellian tactic of using corruption to control the politics. Same thing with what the CCP is trying to do in Greenland and otherwise. If they can push the United States out, if they can make business deals, they don't need to conquer it. They can control it through non-military means. And if they can control the business, the economy, the infrastructure, they can control the government. And if they control the government, they can push America out. That's the reality of it. Not only that, but if they can build in the Arctic without a proper missile defense system in Greenland, and if America is not able to deploy it properly, the whole vision of the Golden Dome, which Trump wants, is not possible. And let me rephrase that. It would be possible to an extent, but the interception, the ability to intercept ballistic missiles especially, would be kind of like a last-minute thing. It would not be very strong. The other side of it is that mutually assured destruction in the event of a nuclear war is the draw of having nuclear weapons. And if you were to eliminate the promise of mutually assured destruction, you might make it so countries really try to prevent it, because it means you can nuke them and they can't nuke you back. And so this could effectively be a big old checkmate on the hand of Trump if America gets Greenland and builds a system that can protect us against nuclear attack or mutually assured destruction. That's also why it's such a big deal for Russia and China right now. That said, happy Monday, everybody. What do you think? Let me know in the chat. Do you think that Trump should take Greenland? Do you think this is crazy? Do you think he's a madman? Is he behaving like a good old-fashioned conqueror? Is he any better than Russia taking Ukraine? Or do you think this is justified, needed, necessary, and Europe is wrong for trying to stop us from doing it? I want to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the chat. And also, join me again tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, for more great discussions. In the meantime, folks, thank you all so much for being here. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day, as always. Enjoy your freedom and your lack of, you're not having separation of races. You can all drink from the same water fountain. Isn't that great? Thank you so much for being here. Join me tomorrow. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.